Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jason Isaac. I'm the founder and CEO of the American Energy Institute. We're a few different organizations. We're a 501c3 organization. We're also a 501c6. So the C6 is a trade organization that represents American energy producers that unabashedly support American energy and free markets. The trade organization was put together about 8 or 9 months ago with the feedback from some people that I had worked with at the Texas Public Policy Foundation when I was there leading their energy and environment effort for about 6 years, frustrated with existing trade organizations that they felt like were capitulating to political agendas. And so they challenged me to come up with a different solution, a different option. And so we primarily represent companies that are in the oil and gas, coal and nuclear space, not all of the above, affordable and reliable. And I say not all of the above because all of the above includes things that are heavily subsidized that wouldn't survive without our assistance. So I like to say affordable and reliable because I think that's really the primary driver of energy has to human flourishing and to mankind. So we also have a 501c3, which is a nonprofit research organization. We do research on the impacts of ESG policies in states like Texas. I say ESG policies, but it's really, that was a term that I remember the first time, I think it was Bud Brigham brought that term up to me and I didn't know what it was, and I said, what is that? And I was like, oh, you mean discrimination. Because it's really what it was, is we were seeing financial institutions discriminate against responsible American energy producers. And so we've got research that shows the impacts on that, because now we see some groups that are saying, oh, Texas's efforts to push back against these financial institutions is costing them millions of dollars. And actually it's not. It's saving Texas millions of dollars because our tax dollars aren't being weaponized against responsible American energy producers. And the bond market, the local bond market, is now more competitive in Texas because of some of this policy. So I think it's good. Same thing in Oklahoma and other states that have passed bills back to pushing back against some of this weaponization or discrimination of capital. So two different organizations. We're out trying to build this up and kind of think we're at a good spot with the results that happened last week. So some pretty exciting news that some people may not have been expecting, but I think it gives us a foothold going into a new administration to really reduce the cost of energy, because we've seen astronomical increases over the last few years. So I appreciate Chris Wright hosting us here at Liberty. This is not my first trip here. I was here with my son a couple of years ago, who proudly worked in the oil field this past summer in Midland and loved it. I think had a lot of inspiration being in this office, although it's not like Midland at all in here.
The views are similar,
The
though.
views are similar, yeah, absolutely. But thanks so much for hosting us. We wanted to have this conversation and just talk a little bit about a post-election outlook. So rather than me doing introductions, I've introduced myself. Prior to starting the foundation or the association, I was a 4-term legislator in Texas. I served in the Texas House of Representatives. I term limited myself. I did an 8-year sentence, and that was enough. And now we're gluttons for punishment. My wife is going into her 2nd term in the legislature. It took her about 8 weeks to outshine my 8 years of work. Not surprising, but she's doing a great job. So now I can actually make a living, because you can't do that in the legislature in Texas. But here we are. Chris, if you'll take a second, introduce yourself. I know probably everybody in this room knows you, but for those that may be listening to this at a later point in time, because we are recording the audio and maybe some video from this.
Oh, okay. Lifelong energy nerd, tech nerd turned energy entrepreneur, and founder and CEO of Liberty Energy, where we're sitting right now, and a fan of Jason's. I met Jason probably 10 years ago. Just left the legislature, and smart, articulate, writes well, and committed to common sense, right? We want more energy to make people's lives better, and if we're going to have more energy, we've got advantages in the United States. Why not as much as possible from right here? So we've been aligned from the start, and happy to be here in this dialogue and sitting next to this lovely young gal who I've also known probably about 10 years. Yeah. Which is maybe when she graduated from high school or college or something like that, but also a passionate, smart, thoughtful, lean in energy commentator. Trisha, over to you.
So PetroNerds, he just likes the name.
I do.
Yeah, we met in 2017 actually, which I remember vividly because Chris was speaking and I was just in awe. I thought he was the coolest person ever, and so hit it off then, because I had a business called PetroNerds, and I was just starting out my business in Denver. And people like Chris were really kind to me and would take meetings with me and talk to me. And so I started getting my sea legs in Denver. And so I'm deeply passionate about this business, just like Chris and Jason. I'm an economist, like a tag-on economist with the American Energy Institute. I also work with the Common Sense Institute on common sense stuff here in Denver, Colorado. And I do energy policy but really US shale, China, geopolitics, sort of a gauntlet. So everything we're gonna get in here today, the stuff that Chris talks about covering. So I'm pumped to be here.
I was telling my son just this morning, he was driving back from East Texas to Lubbock to go back to school. And I was telling him, I was like, you are the average of the 5 people that you surround yourself with. And so when I surround myself with people like Chris Wright and Trisha Curtis, that makes me a whole lot smarter. I'm sorry, it probably brings y'all's average down, but I try to surround myself with incredible people. We've got Molly Vogt on our team here. Trevor Lewis in the back is on our team. He's at the School of Mines. He's helping us out with some incredible research that we should be launching next week on EV subsidies and how much you're paying for EVs, even if you don't have one. So I do try to surround myself, and I was telling my son this, surround yourself with the smartest people that are out there, because then you'll raise your average, and you might lower theirs, but that's all right. Whatever it takes, right, to build yourself up. But let's talk. So we've just had an exciting announcement, I think, this morning with the post-election. The cabinet's already starting to come together. You're on a list. People are trying to push you for a position. Do you have any insight? I don't know if you know this, but I think you might have some insight. There's a lot of people that are saying this would be a great person to be Secretary of Energy. What are your thoughts?
Well, no comment on that, that's for sure. But
I think this room would certainly will.
No comment on that.
Okay.
But of course, look, I've been a lifelong someone passionate about energy. And my wife got me a license plate recently that's energy sober, which is like one of the lines. I think that's what I want. I get thanked a lot for being an advocate for oil and gas. And I always say I'm not an advocate for oil and gas. I'm not wired to be an advocate. I'm just wired to be candid and thoughtful and say what I actually believe. So everything has advantages and trade-offs. Just the advantages of oil and gas, particularly domestic oil and gas, are just gigantically larger than the downsides. And so all I want to see is just a more thoughtful dialogue on all the different energy sources. The global energy system underpins everything we do every day of our lives. It's just too important to be political and be silly about. And we've seen just so much really, truly destructive policy moves in this country, in Europe, in our state of Colorado, that really don't have meaningful environmental benefits, but they just shrink the opportunities in people's lives and displace jobs and businesses outside of our state of Colorado or outside of the country of the United States. Like, I just can't imagine a more efficient way to make people's lives less good. And so, yes, I am adamantly against that.
Great. I know I heard you speak, was it this summer in Washington, D.C. at an event at the Heritage? And I think you summed it up well, and I probably shortened it and simplified what you said, but you said it incredibly well, that energy isn't part of the economy, it's the heart of the economy. Do you think the next administration is going to recognize that?
Absolutely. I mean, look, Trump's a real estate developer from New York City and he lives in Florida, right? Those are not places where energy is produced in any meaningful amount. He's not in the energy business. He's actually not overly familiar with it, but he instinctually gets that, yes, as I say, energy is not a sector of the economy. It's the sector of the economy that enables everything else we do. Amen. If you get energy wrong, nothing else matters. But the better you get energy, the less you hear about energy, the less it matters. That's what the shale revolution did. It took energy almost out of the news. Like, we had very high oil prices, very high natural gas prices, fears of energy security, fears of peak resources just in the early 2000s. All that just went away with the arrival of the shale revolution. Over $1 trillion a year savings of consumers by just a flood of new supply. Tough on the oil and gas companies. It's been a rough decade for the businesses, but that's what capitalism is, right? It isn't supposed to cater to the interests of companies. It's to deliver products and services to consumers. And consumers have just been an awesome win in this. And our country, the United States, has been. They go from the largest oil importer in the world to a net exporter, and with natural gas to go from the largest importer in the world to the largest exporter of the world, less than 15 years. Like that's technology, that's innovation, that's good for America, that's good for the world.
That's great. So speaking of natural gas, Trisha, what do you think that this new administration, this new post-election outlook means for natural gas and world energy supply?
So I think it's huge. So I want to piggyback on Chris's comments. I think you probably couldn't have a more night and day approach on energy from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. And Trump does intuitively get it, but it's also just because he's pro-business and low regulation. And there's nothing in this country we've had for 4 years. We've had extremely high regulation, and we've been very anti-business. But we've been this administration has been very anti-domestic oil and gas. So the flip is just switching now. And you're seeing this like the euphoria in the stock market. And it's very fascinating because if you're with business leaders or you talk to a lot of leaders within energy and outside of energy, one of the biggest things that they've really felt was just this burdensome regulation. Like talk to big home developers, like the ability to build a new house in this country, anything. The regulations have just been so heavy. And so that's huge, but then you couple that with high energy prices, and you couple that with this administration sort of got lucky with a global recession happening and lower oil prices. But really, that was not because they looked at the industry and said, please drill more production and help us. They didn't do that. They actually had high oil prices, and that was what enabled over the past 4 years, oil production has creeped its way higher. We're now at 13.5 million barrels per day. So, if you think of just how bad it's been for oil and gas under this administration, and yet how well companies like Chris's and shale has actually performed, which has been really impressive, it's only going to do better under this next administration. You could have lower prices, but and I want to get into, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, that's going to be huge. That's kind of day one thing. That's probably what Trump will do. It was only ratified by one house, but the Biden administration went into the Paris Climate Accords after Trump had pulled out or didn't do it, and now we're going to be pulling out. That's a big signal to the entire world to say we are not in on the green tech thing anymore. And so all those tailwinds that we had with the Biden administration coming in, everyone going bananas about wind and solar and green tech and clean tech, and those tailwinds are gone. And now they're real headwinds, which is what it should have been because they were pretty bad. They came from China in the first place. They're pretty low forms of energy or just inefficient. So I think that changes a lot. And so then gets to things like natural gas. And I get a lot of questions lately on natural gas and nuclear. And I think there's a lot of excitement around nuclear for sure. But I think when we think about natural gas of like what can you really penetrate, a place like in Colorado, if we could get companies like Excel to allow more natural gas into the grid, to stop decommissioning coal, that would be a big difference. But if we can, from a national level, if we can actually get a Trump administration to understand the importance of electricity, and I think he does, because they talk about lowering energy costs. But they're really talking, it's not about necessarily gasoline, it's your energy bill, your utility bill, because you're paying $23 an MCF for natural gas prices. That's the average residential price in the US. When Henry Hub has been, as we all know, way below $2 for almost half of this year. And that's insane. That means utility companies, if you also look on the stock market, they've outperformed everyone because they're just crushing it because they're making massive profits. And so that delta of that natural gas thing, that needs to be shifted, and there's a reality check. So I think an acknowledgement that we need more natural gas, we need to stop decommissioning coal and getting rid of reliable baseload power, just stop demonizing natural gas, allowing it to get into the grid, but then really allowing for exports. So removing the pause in LNG permits, that's going to be a day one thing, so that'll be great. That sends a signal to the entire global market that we are open for business. You can sign a long-term contract with us. We're going to commit to it. We're going to be there. And that really does help with investment. And I think if this administration, because if they have both houses of Congress, they're going to look to make things more sticky on energy. They don't want this, they're probably not going to want this repealed 4 years later if that happens. So you want things sticky, you want people to be able to invest in this and to actually get off the map. And I think natural gas investment is one of the single biggest things in terms of infrastructure, just compression, everything, fracking, from fracking it to actually exporting it. It's game changing for us to consume it more in our electricity pool, directly in our homes, but also export it to the world. And that really helps, we have a little low oil prices, but we have slightly higher gas prices. That helps on margins. There's a lot of levers on energy. The power or the capacity of this administration to do a lot on energy is really, really, really high. There are a lot of levers that can be moved around here.
So, Chris, with this new administration, do you think we see an increase in domestic production? We're already at record highs now. Do you think there's an opportunity to produce even more, get more infrastructure built? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. We're not going to see a flood of new production because that's about economics and capital investment. But if you can't get permits securely on federal land, you can't build new gathering lines, you can't build pipelines and infrastructure, we're not developing new basins, we're not setting that next generation, that's going to change. Investment in infrastructure is going to grow. We're going to be able to move products anymore. We're going to build better export facilities. I think, Jason, a huge thing is we're going to resource energy-intensive manufacturing in this country. Like the US, round numbers, 100 exajoules of energy is consumed a year in our country. 25 exajoules for transportation, 25 exajoules for industrial, manufacturing things. China consumes 20 exajoules for transportation, less than the United States, and 70 exajoules for manufacturing, almost 3 times as much as we do. We've been the manufacturing powerhouse for a century, and now almost 3 times as much energy-intensive manufacturing is done in China than the United States. That's crazy. And of course, it's produced in China dominantly energy sourced from coal versus, and I'm not against coal. It's been the largest electricity source for 100 years and will be for decades more. I'm not anti-coal. But natural gas is even better. If you make something in China out of coal instead of in the US out of natural gas, and then you load it on a diesel-powered ship to bring it back, like there's nothing green or environmental in that. It's really just pushing blue-collar jobs overseas and making things a little bit more expensive. So I would love to see reinvestment in heavy industry in the United States to make things here with the energy resource, because that's easier. We're going to continue to export more natural gas, but we could produce 20% more natural gas if we had a market for it here in the United States. And if you bring manufacturing of energy-intensive goods back, you'll see that increase. But one of the other reasons we haven't seen much talk or investment in that, Biden was only president for 4 years. We've had nearly a 50% rise in the average cost of electricity in our country. Think of how crazy that is. 43% of US electricity, by far the largest source, came from natural gas. Natural gas's price over the last 4 years have gone down, but yet electricity up almost 50% in less than 4 years. In fact, that's part of the election thing. Why are we making energy more expensive? Are you going to build a big manufacturing plant in the United States that's had this nearly 50% rise in prices, and we got a new administration that's going to continue those same policies? You're not going to bring tens of billions of dollars in workers and investment here, but we're going to change direction now. And we need to show that a lasting change of direction so that we will bring investment and capital and jobs back to our country.
That's what I try to convince policymakers around the country is this threat to deindustrialization. You look at what's happened in Germany, it's over half of the automobile manufacturing facilities are offline, they're not working.
Say that again.
Yeah, half
the capacity.
Half of the capacity for automobile manufacturing in Germany. The largest economy in Europe is offline. Just last week, Volkswagen announced they're going to shut down, I think, lay off 1,400 jobs.
10% pay cut, 3 auto manufacturing plants, which has never happened in Volkswagen's history, and tens of thousands of jobs. Everybody gets immediate 10% pay cut. This is Volkswagen, and this is exactly to the core of the China problem, is that China's decimated German manufacturing, and if we had not had a Trump election, that's the road you were going to go down, and you'll have to take a while to get manufacturing back. But to Chris's point, we went from 13 cents a kilowatt hour to 18 cents a kilowatt hour in 4 years. And we had flat electricity prices. We had 13 cents a kilowatt hour across the US for a decade. And then all of a sudden we had overnight. And it's mind altering here in Colorado because we have these conversations with people saying, well, it's with the line of inflation and we can rise with the line of inflation. We had no inflation in electricity, none, 0 in electricity. Even when you had inflation and other stuff that was sub 2%, you didn't have electricity. So it's a really, really big deal to do this. But in China, you also have, it's not just coal-fired power generation, which they have a lot of, but they subsidize everything. So it doesn't matter. They'll just dump it out there to compete. So this is a president, if you not know anything about Trump, he is there to tariff China, and he's there to level the playing field. And that is going to have some impacts to the U.S., but one of those should be an impetus, and you're already seeing it. You're already seeing companies immediately come out here and say, this is our exposure to China for X stuff, and they're already looking to see how much more they can source into the U.S. immediately because they just don't want that tariff impact. So you're already having an immediate impact, and he's not even in office yet.
So I had go ahead, Chris, jump.
So Trisha, I really want to disagree with you, but you said China killed German manufacturing. I would say
they both
Germany killed German manufacturing. They literally
allowed them to.
But Germany did this to themselves. I think it's an incredibly valuable case study that we all have to look at what not to do, what the direction. I wrote a LinkedIn post about that today, linking a Wall Street Journal article. It's truly crazy what this country that's, from the birthplace of, along with England, the Industrial Revolution, the greatest machine tool making country in the world, like a truly industrial powerhouse. Its industrial output today is 20% lower than it was 5 years ago. The world economy is bigger than it was 5 years ago. They just continue to drive bad energy policy, which just cripples everything else.
And bad policy.
Yeah.
They chose to double down with Germany, just like they chose to double down with Russia. Or Germany chose to double down with China, and they're doing it again. But their exports, you can see their auto exports to China and their auto exports in from China. And it's just decimated. And I mean, Germany's going through upheaval. If you stay up late and watch the stock market, that's all we talked about last night, was what's going on within Germany and the fact that they're going through a recession and their politics are a mess and they can't get people to work.
They're going to have their own Trump election in the next year or two.
Yeah, they really will. And I think that already started to happen this year with some people winning some seats that they weren't expecting to win. So I think there's an energy transition happening there. Hopefully it comes back to the right way. But you saw BASF, largest chemical manufacturing company, moving operations from Germany to China, laying off thousands of jobs. That's terrible. I've joked, and I've had an opportunity to testify in front of Congress 4 times now, and I've said of all the technology the Chinese steal from us, it'd be nice if they would utilize our pollution control technology. And they don't. I mean, we're world leaders in clean air, and I know we've had some conversations in the West Wing of the White House where we've talked about the difference between a Paris, and I'm completely on board with us pulling out of Paris. I live a high carbon lifestyle. I think the rest of the world should too. It's where you have economic prosperity and environmental leadership. I said that in front of Congress, and Congressman Raskin called me the carbon king. That's what my license plate says. And it does. So does my business card and my name tag. But I digress here. We were actually talking about a Pittsburgh Accord, where we had this idea, and I can't remember who came up with the idea, but it's brilliant. And we're thinking, because President Trump, when he first got elected, he said, I represent the people of Pittsburgh, not the people of Paris. And we thought, well, let's have a Pittsburgh Accord. We'll fly in, we'll do the signing. Let's call on our trading partners to meet air quality standards that improve human health. We've gone too far here in this country. And we're world leaders in clean air, reducing pollution nearly 80% over the last 5 decades. During the COVID lockdowns, took half the cars off the road, and the air quality did not improve in this country. And there were some cities where it got worse. Austin, it got worse. We're at a natural state. We're number one when it comes to clean air. Or we're number one when it comes to access to clean and safe drinking water. And again, world leaders in clean air. And these are some messaging points that just a lot of people don't know. That we've got to celebrate our economic prosperity because of access to affordable and reliable energy. And yes, I know you and the Bettering Human Lives Foundation does a lot of work on this globally, because wouldn't it be nice if 3.5 billion people on the planet could experience the clean air and the clean water that we do?
And Jason, I love that you expanded it right there. Low cost energy means higher standard of living, more jobs, all those economic things. You brought it to the environmental side as well, which I think is critical. I grew up in Denver. I'm looking at Susie Law right here. I grew up here. 50 years ago, as a young kid in elementary school, Denver's population was 1/3 of what it is today, and the air quality was just massively worse. 1/3 of the days we couldn't even see the mountains. Look at it today. Denver's got economically bigger, stronger. We do more things. We travel. We do all these things that are supposedly evil of consuming more energy, but just massive improvement of air quality. That's technology, common sense. In fact, more and better energy is positive for the environment as well.
Yes.
And thank you for pointing that out. And the data is compelling.
Yeah. So, Trisha, I talked a little bit earlier about this bill that I helped write in Texas in 2020 that I had a tough time with, because as a free market guy, it's like, wait a second, if I have to tell a financial institution that they can't do business with the state, that's really not free market principles. But I said, and I wrote, if you're boycotting fossil fuels, then you can't do business with the state of Texas. I got to define what boycott meant, which was fun. BlackRock doesn't like my definition, but they're on the boycott list in Texas. So as an economist, how do you feel about, as you talked about tariffs, and that word kind of lit up in my mind, what are your thoughts on some of the tariffs that are being proposed, and how do you grapple with that as an economist?
Look, I'll be completely honest that I didn't love everything about the Trump administration in the first one. And initially, and I've changed my mind on this, initially I was a little bit more hesitant of just immediately with tariffs of like my economic knowledge, like this can't be good. But I am definitely a China hawk. And I say that simplistically, but I study China for a living, and I take it really, really seriously. And I think if people had even a fraction of the idea of what was happening in China, not just that everything was made with coal-fired power plants, but the majority of it's made with forced labor, and that's how you can make such cheap goods, and you can dump them into Germany, and they're stupid enough to take it. But you can dump them here in America too. So we don't have the problems with our EVs, but we have the problems with our cheap goods. And so, this tariff thing is when he said, I'm going to use tariffs. And if you listen to the Joe Rogan podcast, he actually articulated on tariffs for a while and said, I think it's the most beautiful word in the English language. And, he's thinking about it in a few different ways. And that's that it's a way to, the market reaction was very interesting. I mean, the first reaction on Bloomberg when he was about to be, they were about to call him as the winner, they said, oh my gosh, my European friends are freaking out because they're saying we're going to have European tariffs. And there wasn't a lot of talk of European tariffs in the election, but now there's a little talk of it, just tariffs across the board. And I think really it's a carrot and a stick approach. It's really how do we get people to the table and how do we start maneuvering things. So when you start the conversation off with China that you're going to tariff 60%, that means China starts immediately negotiating. So we've never had this with China ever. I mean, it was the Trump administration was the first administration, and I give credit where credit is due, and I will criticize where I need to criticize, and I'm plenty vocal about that. But this was the first administration, and we haven't had one that's been critical on China, that actually looks at China and says, no, it's called genocide, what you're doing with the Uyghurs in the province of Xinjiang when you're making those solar panels and the wind turbines, and we're going to call it genocide. And the Trump administration actually called it that. So things like tariffs are a great way. We have a foreign adversary. There's one country that is helping fund the war. I mean, they're funding Iran. They're importing about 2.5 million barrels a day from Iran at an $80 oil price or $70 oil price. That's several $billion a month. So if you want to go after that, Trump's going to sanction Iran, the crude out of Iran hard, and that's going to impact China. And he's probably going to look to Saudi Arabia. They're going to increase barrels. We're going to probably try to increase a little bit. There's a lot of different things he can do. But with China, those tariffs are going to be, that's going to impact cheap goods that come into Walmart. I mean, if you look at stocks today, Dollar Tree, Dollar General, Five Below, all the stocks are getting hammered right now because the exposure to China goods is so cheap. And that could be a wake-up call to people. Hey, one, do you need all those cheap goods? And two, to really Chris's point, we need to be making things here with cheap natural gas. And I can't tell you how many business leaders I talk to that make things, that manufacture things, and are not, they don't understand energy, right? They don't understand the manufacturing process. They don't understand that they need low-cost energy. And the Wall Street Journal in July of this year had a big article on manufacturing in automobiles, and I thought the Wall Street Journal was going to come out and say, hey, we need more natural gas. And they didn't. They talked about the high cost to auto manufacturers because of the rising cost of energy in the US. And the answer at the end of the article was, we need to subsidize wind and solar for auto manufacturers in America. And I thought, you're crazy. This is absolutely crazy. So the tariff implication is going to be on, it is going to be in autos, and he talked about that in some podcasts as well. Trump said he had some ideas of that. You're going to get your loan forgiveness, like your interest payments on your auto loans. He said, we're going to make that tax deductible. And he says, but I got a better idea. It's only going to be tax deductible if the car is made in America. And so those things are going to really push companies to push it here. And that already has an implication where now these auto manufacturers might get the bright idea that, hey, we need to start thinking about natural gas. We need to start thinking about making sure we have lower cost energy. But there needs to be an education. A lot of people don't know all this stuff. But I think the tariffs it's a negotiation approach immediately. There's a lot of implications for it, but I would say don't get ahead of your skis on, it's not going to be an immediate 60% tariff on everything. But this administration, I think, is going to look to make the BS on China be a lot more sticky. They do not want a new president coming in and change and going back to Henry Kissinger style. We just kowtow, we do everything with China. Similar to this administration, although they kept a lot of the Trump's tariffs because they couldn't really remove them, but we're slowly progressing to just a level set and understanding with China. And I heard today that a lot of people around him are actively, so talk about decouple, nobody's wanted to use those words, that they absolutely 100% want to decouple. And personally, I think it's a great thing, but there are some costs that come with that.
So Chris, last question kind of before we open it up for audience Q&A, so get your minds rolling now. Zeldin announced today as EPA administrator. I think it was the day after the election that Duke Energy came out and said, if there's changes within the EPA, we are not going to continue early retirement of coal-fired power plants. It'll actually keep some on to provide affordable and reliable electricity. Do you think we see a greater move towards affordability and reliability from the electric generation side or just in general?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Look, we've been in, 20 years or whatever, where climate has been the biggest issue, and the cost of energy, we don't talk about it too much, or it's bad here. And it was secondary, right? Because the whole planet was going to die if we didn't You know, I mean, it is crazy to me how this has swept up middle of the road, thoughtful politicians of all sides. Like climate change, and again, I write and talk about it, it's a real thing, it's a global phenomenon, it's slow moving, it just isn't even remotely close to the world's most important challenge. And everything that you hold dear depends on reliable, affordable, secure energy. So Jason, yes, I think there will be a dramatic shift in the views and attitudes of that. Utilities have driven these huge costs in electricity. They've taken these plants down. They built this crazy crap. That's not because they decided that was a good idea. This is governments and regulatory pressures that have forced them to make just massively poor investments at giant scale. And I think they sense we may not have to keep doing that. We may not have to keep doing that. A good charter of a utility, it starts with affordable, secure energy. That's their mandate. And they've been forced to betray it. So yeah, I'm very optimistic that we will see aggressive changes in posture, in investment, and towards our electricity grid. Now, the problem in our electricity grid has been going on for a decade or more. That's the scary part. Yeah. It's not going to be fixed in a year or two. The attitude, the money flows is going to change. But we're going to see more expensive and less reliable electricity in the coming years because we have a demand driver with AI. They're less price sensitive. They're going to buy that electricity, and we've been enfeebling the grid for a long time. So the trajectory and dialogue is going to change right away. The reality is going to have a lag. I just hope that messaging doesn't get hurt.
Yeah.
But it couldn't come soon enough.
It could not.
Otherwise, it's terrible to think where we'd be 4 years from now with growing demand and continued enfeeblization and a terrible investment climate. Fortunately, that's a counterfactual we're never going to know.
Yeah. Deindustrialization would be
yes,
happening.
Exactly.
Hopefully it won't. Hopefully it's the energy sobriety has reached the opportunity right now to be throughout our government policies, and hopefully, like J.D. Vance said, they're going to pull back on some of these subsidies because the market distorting policies, all we're getting out of them is higher costs and more debt and higher inflation. And so that's, again, one of the reasons we advocate for free market policies, and hopefully cars will be affordable too because...
But so that's the headwinds and tailwinds that you talked about.
Yeah.
Of like, utilities are publicly traded. So we have a Colorado Public Utilities Commission that apparently has some people on it that advocate for the consumer. I don't think they've done a very good job advocating for the consumer because they seem to just pass along the rate increases. So these utility companies, yes, the regulations, but it kind of gets a little hairy of when the regulation started and when the utility company said I'm going to hit net zero 2050 and then the regulation happened after. Feels like there's a little bit of a collusion on the top. Not saying there is, just feels like it. And I think this is a nice level set to say, we're no longer, I would love to hear an EPA administrator or Secretary of Energy come out and say, we're done with the utilities screwing over the consumer. We're over that. So you want to talk about price gouging? We're going to look at you gouging the consumer. We're going to find out what's real, and we're going to make sure we should have had deflation a deflation with natural gas prices priced there, and we haven't. So it's to me, it's almost criminal what's happened with utilities, and that the tailwinds and the headwinds, that's going to be a change in level set where this conversation starts getting in, and utility companies are going to have to start talking about affordability and reliability within their earnings calls, and they don't right now. At least not the one here.
Hallelujah, get me fired up. I'm like, yes, I want to clap and cheer. Let's open it up for questions that anybody may have in the audience for any of us. Yes, James.
Hi, thanks for doing this afternoon to everybody on the panel. So the EPA this year rolled out new environmental regulations, and so now we have the methane rule. So we have the waste emissions charge, we have the new emissions regulations targeted at methane mitigation in Quad OB, and some other changes to the greenhouse gas emissions reporting program. What is your expectation of how the Trump administration is going to delay, change, react? Can they get rid of them? Can they modify them? Can they reduce enforcement? I mean, I have a lot of clients who are really interested in that.
It's complicated. It's very complicated. But I think the trajectory will change. But yeah, most rules you can't just write them away. But what I think it hopefully will drive is there'll be studies done. If you propose a rule and the regulatory cost is 100 and the potential benefit in human health or whatever is 5, if you're spending 100 to get 5, that's what a lot of what the EPA is doing now. I mean, the EPA sort of climate rules on both cars that are essentially driving that you have to make dominantly electric cars, and power plant rules that future thermal power plants have to have CO2 sequestration. Those are massive imposed costs, and whatever economic model and assumptions you want to put in, just nearly nil positive human benefits. So it will take time to unwind some of that stuff. My hope is at the end there's structural changes. I wanted to pass a law in Colorado that you can't do something unless you can make an economic case of why the benefits are going to exceed the costs of what you're going to do. And I think that idea may sound crazy in politics. Could that come into the EPA in the next 4 years? I think there's a reasonable chance it will. Yeah, it's a very different strident attitude that we're not going to tack a little bit differently, along the same course. I think you're going to see very bold actions to try to bring sobriety and economics and concern for human well-being back into EPA decisions. I'm an optimist there, but not overnight.
No, it's going to be a minute. It'll take a minute, but I think that they're going to immediately, who they're picking. And I mean, there's a COP meeting going on right now in Azerbaijan, and all they were talking about at midnight last night was things are going to shift, and they think that China is going to lead the world on climate, which is not going to happen. But they don't realize that this administration and those running DC are not going to care. They're going to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. So I think pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, but also the Climate Change Executive Order 14008, that's going to be gone tomorrow. I mean, that's going to be gone the moment Trump gets into office on day one. And so that executive order had a lot of stuff in it on emphasizing climate change, everything to do with climate as an existential threat. So that's what, again, some of those tailwinds and headwinds shift immediately. And so the EPA stuff, the stuff that's easier, it's sticky, you can't switch it off overnight, but the enforcement of it or the ability to tweak it, I do think that this group of people in this administration is going to work pretty hard to tweak it and to level set what the EPA can do, especially on stuff like that.
Because they have, I'm sorry, just one other question, because the waste emission charge goes into effect for emissions reported this year. And it starts at $650 a metric ton. So if you emit CO2 equivalent of more than 25,000 metric tons, then you have to pay a charge per ton of that. And it hikes up every year after that. And what they've also done is change the definition of a facility. It's not just the tank battery, it's the entire basin. So now everyone's going to be paying the carbon tax next year unless something changes.
This is the structural problem, in a free society, is the default direction of a government is to grow. Everybody wants to grow their business. This is by far the biggest business in the United States, and they've been very effective for a century in growing that business. Reagan, our boldest reformer before, I think we're going to see a new high in that. But our boldest reformer wasn't able to actually shrink the government, but he stopped the growth of it for 8 years, which was incredibly liberating in itself. I think we will see real attempts to actually shrink it, but it's very hard. But it's very important. Otherwise, you get eventually to stagnation, and the government's half the economy, and you get Germany with nearly zero economic growth for 5 years and probably for many more going forward. We don't want to go there, but it's easier to grow the government than to shrink it.
Yeah, much easier. And that's one thing I ask myself as a legislator, what are we doing to constrain the growth of government? And then it's like at the end of the legislative session, what did we do to constrain the growth of government? And it just seemed like every session I served, it was very, very little, if any at all. It's interesting though, and I think this $2 trillion of spending cuts that's being thrown around is certainly possible. You just look at the people that badge in and badge out of federal buildings, and I've heard the number is as high as 80% of the employees don't show up to an office. As high as 80% aren't showing up for work. So I think there's a good opportunity to get rid of some people in the deep state, which would be fascinating. And I think there'd be more freedom for us and great and kind of liberating for Northern Virginia. Questions? Who else? Yes.
Thanks for the panel. I'm Senator Cleve Simpson. I'm serving the Colorado General Assembly here.
Thanks for your service. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Cleve.
The national trajectory may be going one way, but I suspect the state of Colorado, I don't have any insight, but may double down to go to reverse the trajectory and really buck the new administration. Thoughts or comments about that potential?
Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion, look, I grew up in Colorado. First grade through high school, I love this state. My daughter and son-in-law and grandson live here. My mom lives here. My siblings live here. I love Colorado. But the trajectory in Colorado has been bad for many years now. And I sent some data recently to the governor showing the trajectory of Colorado's oil and gas production relative to the trajectory of shale in the rest of the country. And it's quite disappointing. You know, the production everywhere else is well above pre-COVID highs, not in Colorado. And I just built a manufacturing plant. We're based in Colorado. We just built a big old manufacturing facility in Oklahoma. Why don't we build it in Colorado? Because it's a risky investment to count on getting permits to be able to build and do things in Colorado's labor force. I would desperately want that to be in Colorado. It's in Oklahoma. And thank you for going into that thing, but Colorado should be a place. What Colorado has going for it is just a fantastic place to live, right? And it's got a great history of pro-business and successful things. So it's been a magnet for all these great people, and you don't kill that golden goose right away, but it's slowly being strangled. Last year we had the first year, I think in my lifetime, where Colorado had more people leave it than move into it. That's a hard thing to do when you have the most spectacular outdoors here and a highly educated go-getter population. But I think your efforts are going to matter a lot. Colorado is very much on the wrong trajectory, not just on energy policy, but on just going back top-down control. People in the legislature are going to decide how business is done, what's important and what's not important, and stand in the way of sort of the progress of free people and free decisions. It's disturbing.
And this is where we exist. If we can help in any way, visit with your colleagues, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, to help educate them about our environmental leadership. I mean, those are the messaging movers that work for people. We're world leaders in environmental protection, environmental quality, and we're number one when it comes to access to clean and safe drinking water. And then you talk about expensive energy hurting the poor. And these are things that Trisha and I wrote extensively about. We published several op-eds prior to the election. We've got more in the hopper as it is right now, but educating people about people that are losing their access to electricity. And between 2021 and 2022, 5 million people had their electricity disconnected because they can't afford it. It was a 30% increase from 2022 to 2021. It was a 30% increase in people getting their electricity disconnected in the United States.
Yeah.
It was a 76% increase in people getting their natural gas disconnected in the United States. 5 million people don't have lights, don't have heat. And heat, as you know here in Colorado, is much, and globally, cold temperatures are much more dangerous than hot temperatures, to the tune of 40-1. You'll have 40 freezing deaths to 1 heat-related death, or globally. Yeah. That's appalling. That's energy poverty. And so if we can educate people about the policies that are being proposed, this decarbonization political agenda, and it is a political agenda, net zero, Paris, low energy, low emission future, those are all political agendas that don't do anything but increase the cost of energy. They don't do anything to mitigate a changing climate. They just make everything more expensive. And those messages tend to work well with the left and the right. It's one of the great things about our trade organization is that we can get political and we can share these messages and actually represent energy producers that are okay with that. But as I did research on other trade organizations for 2 years, finding out that, we can't push back on that, and because we've got these, international global players that are embracing ESG and DEI and the Paris Accord and net zero commitments by 2030 or 2035. I'm like, those are political agendas. And we can't push back. We can, and we will, absolutely. So if we can be a resource at all, please let us know.
But I would say Colorado, to Chris's point, I think it is going to double down. So I think, and I'm not pleased. I mean, doing the work I've done with Common Sense Institute, I'm beyond frustrated. I mean, living in Colorado, I was born in Wyoming, and I'm proud to say that. Because I met with the governor of Wyoming in September, and it was like a breath of fresh air for him to say, we embrace our coal, and I love that we have low electricity price for our people that live here. And I mean, can you imagine if Colorado had a governor that would say, I'm happy to have low electricity prices and reliability for the people who live here? We don't have that. And I mean, the governor goes around all the time demonizing the industry and talking about how bad natural gas is, but then, talking to the industry and making deals with them. I mean, and there's just a lot of, we do need to level up the intelligence and the ability for people to really kind of understand and push back, and that's why I say Colorado Public Utility Commission. Like, Coloradans need to understand that we're producing 450,000 barrels per day of oil an hour from here, but we could be producing a hell of a lot more. And we are producing 5 billion cubic feet per day, but we could be producing a lot more. And so the revenue to the state could be a lot higher. And yes, we have the highest air emission standards in the whole damn country in Colorado. And so everybody's doing it right, but the leaders of this state don't want oil and gas here, and they want wind and solar at any cost. Literally, I just went through the cost. At any cost, this administration, the Pulse administration, is willing, doesn't care how much you all pay for it. They will take wind and solar and to get net zero. As a state, Colorado is 0.24% of global CO2 emissions. We could not exist tomorrow, and we wouldn't do a damn thing to global CO2 emissions. And that is so critically important, is that's what has to be pushed back on the legislative scene of saying, this cost is so high. And so if you want to start a business, and even for me having a business here, it doesn't seem right anymore. It seems like businesses need to be leaving because it doesn't make sense to have a business here when, the state doesn't support it. And I'm hearing business leaders that I knew were devout people that lived in Denver, Cherry Creek, and they're leaving. The amount of people I hear that are moving out, that have lived here forever, that are, happily leaving Cherry Creek quickly, it's incredible. And that's just because they just don't, I think they don't agree with politics, but also it's the cost of living, and they just don't see the trajectory getting any better. So my concern is that Colorado is just becoming California, and that they're hell-bent on going down that road, just like Germany. They're hell-bent on doing these policies, and we know what not to do. California oil production declines by over 1,000 barrels a day, several hundred barrels a day each month. It just goes like this. And Colorado's been able to keep that up, but that's one of the things that is keeping up our budget as well. This revenue coming in. So it's really, really serious. I'm pretty afraid it's not going the right way, but I'm happy to do everything I can to educate and push back on it.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I want to be mindful of Chris and Trisha's time. I think a couple of us are catching flights back, or she's going to Oklahoma, I'm going back to Texas, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Before we wrap up, are there any veterans in the room? Wow, thank you very much for your service. Appreciate it. Thank you all. I'm excited that one of your veteran colleagues, Lee Zeldin, will be heading up the EPA, so that'll be good. It's another big win for veterans and hopefully for America. But thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here. If you want to learn more about our work at the American Energy Institute, or might have any companies that might be interested in joining, please let us know. We want to continue to advance the message to liberate American energy. Thank you again. Appreciate it, Chris.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Trisha. Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Trisha.